thanks very much everyone for coming along, and I hope you've had a nice day. And it's lovely to see so many people who've turned up and are interested somewhat in the subject. I thought that I'd actually just begin with a very brief anecdote that I had a thought when they were unveiling the plaque a little while ago. And I suddenly remembered that the first time I ever came across Robert Weir Fox was in a footnote by Michael Faraday in a paper that he wrote about 1831 when he was announcing the discovery of electromagnetic induction. And he makes a comment on terrestrial magnetism. And there's a footnote, and it says, the leading authority on this is Robert Weir Fox of Falmouth. Because I was from Totnes, obviously the southwest, I said, well, you don't often get people from the southwest appearing in footnotes of Michael Faraday's papers. And I thought, I've come a long way from that footnote to a blue plaque, and so you never know where research is going to take you, which I think is quite exciting. Anyway, so on a small, I'd say ugly ship, far out to sea, an experiment is underway. The ship's captain logs the date. It's the 3rd of December 1839, and the position 24 minutes north, 330 degrees east, halfway between Africa and Brazil. He takes a bearing with his compass. Its magnetic needle oscillates gently and gradually comes to rest, indicating north. The experimentalist, the captain, aligns a second magnetized needle, suspended vertically in a circular metal case, so that it sits along a north to south meridian. This instrument, as I'm sure you're all aware, is known as a dipping needle. It vibrates mysteriously in response to the Earth's magnetic field before settling. The captain reads off the angle displayed, 37 degrees 41 minutes. This measure of the Earth's magnetic pull, or dip, would be 0 degrees, were the instrument at the north or south pole, where the planet's magnetic influence is so strong as to pull the needle straight down, sort of as indicated here. The next matter to determine is the strength or intensity of this magnetic influence. The experimentalist takes out 2 magnets of known magnetic intensity and screws them into the back of the circular case, recording their impact on the needle. He screws these in, and then by observing this influence and comparing it to past readings, doing exactly the same thing at different locations, he produces an idea, basically a measure of the Earth's relative intensity. He affixes a silk thread to the dipping needle and adds tiny weights, coercing the needle back to the original dip. The magnets that he's just put in, they've moved the needle somewhat. He now corrects it by adding weights. With an earlier measure using this method taken in London, used as an index of 1, the intensity recorded here he calculates to be 0.712, revealing a relatively weaker magnetic intensity to that found in the capital back in Britain. Day after day, week after week, the experimentalist pursues this laborious regime as his ship voyages over thousands of nautical miles. The data collected provides a representation of how the Earth's magnetic qualities vary over time and space. The experimentalist is one of a network of practitioners armed with similar dipping needles built here in Falmouth, performing uniformed magnetic readings on ships and in observatories all around the world. Together they're performing a vast synchronized experimental inquiry to determine the magnetic state of the entire planet. Yet despite this systematic regime, this is not a simple process. As the dipping needle oscillates, the sway of the ship on the rolling sea makes reading the dial incredibly difficult, and the needle is loath to settle, which can only be remedied by rubbing a pin attached to the back in contact with the needle with this ivory disc. The ship's onboard iron is constantly interfering with the dipping needle. The experimentalist must keep a check on this and distinguish it from the magnetic influence of the Earth, which is amazingly complicated. Worse still, the needle's own magnetic character has an alarming tendency to change, being sensitive to vibrations, which obviously are quite common at sea. During the voyage, the needle has lost magnetic intensity on several occasions, forcing the captain to remove it, remagnetize it by stroking it with a permanent magnet, and then basically putting it back in the tin. But he hates this process because it risks damaging the inconceivably fine pins on which the needle oscillates, positioned here within these diamond or ruby pallets that you sort of see in the centre. Should one of these pins break or these jewels be damaged, the instrument's rendered useless. And obviously he's a long way from someone who can repair it. But above all, this experimental programme is hard to enact because the Earth's magnetic field is so capricious, with the magnetic poles and equator constantly shifting. In endeavouring to produce precise measurements, the experimentalists must contend with a transient phenomena and a catalogue of ever-shifting variables, all while working on a moving warship with some of the most delicate scientific apparatus ever constructed. This is an age of empire, and it's an age of industry, but I don't think it's too much to say that this is also an age of immense ambition. So let's return to our little ship, far out on the Atlantic. It is, in fact, and obviously, HMS Erebus. And our experimentalist is Captain James Clark Ross. Nearby is HMS Terror, where Captain Crozier also has a fox dipping needle, and he is performing a similar experiment. Their last sight of England was the Lizard, near where we are today, which they passed on the 5th of October, 1839. And since then, they've performed hundreds of magnetic experiments, and they'll continue these until 1843. Tasked with locating the South Magnetic Pole and measuring terrestrial magnetism in the Southern Hemisphere, both ships carry Falmouth-built dipping needles. This expedition marked the start of what became known as the British Magnetic Survey, also known popularly but slightly ahistorically as the Magnetic Crusade, which is a very American term, which under Edward Sabine's fanatical direction would utilise the Royal Navy, the British Army and Britain's growing collection of overseas territories in the worldwide surveying of the Earth's magnetism. Though largely forgotten, this investigation, the first truly global experimental inquiry, was a response to the great scientific problem of the age. This was, and I hate the rhetoric, it was the global warming of the 19th century, troubling natural philosophers, empire builders, capitalists and politicians alike. At stake here was more than the behaviour of a natural phenomenon, but the navigation of the world's premier imperial power. The science of terrestrial magnetism was above all the science of empire. So why exactly was terrestrial magnetism so problematic, and why did it matter? Caused by electric currents in the Earth's spinning molten core, which rotated at a different speed to the Earth's crust, the fluctuation of the world's magnetic field has been a well-known phenomenon since the 15th century. As the Earth's magnetic field changes over time and space, its influence on a magnetised needle varies. In particular, the tendency of the magnetic poles to wander meant that the difference between magnetic and geographic north, as shown on charts, was constantly altering. The Earth's magnetic field had two other characteristics: dip being the horizontal angle given by a magnetised needle pointed towards the magnetic North Pole, and intensity being the strength of the Earth's magnetic force. These three magnetic elements, deviation, dip and intensity, varied and made navigation by magnetic compass a perilous business. Such navigational challenges grew increasingly urgent as Britain's colonial territories and overseas trade expanded during the 19th century. All this commercial enterprise required precise navigation and reliable knowledge of terrestrial magnetism, especially in the polar regions where the Earth's magnetic field appeared so erratic. Intensifying this concern for a global magnetic survey was the rising use of iron in shipbuilding. As European shipbuilders incorporated larger amounts of metal into their vessels, with full iron hulls introduced for commercial shipping in the 1840s, so the disturbing influence of terrestrial magnetism on a ship's compass became ever more exaggerated. With hundreds of ships lost to compass deviation, panic spread through British society, obviously a maritime power, heightened by spectacular disasters such as the beaching of Isambard Kingdom Brunel's Great Britain, the first oceanic liner constructed almost entirely of iron, which steamed straight into the coast of Ireland in 1846, despite the crew thinking that they were heading off into the Atlantic. Obviously, they blamed the captain and claimed that he was drunk because it was too dangerous to say that the compass was inaccurate because it would have caused panic. And I think on the subject of iron ships, I'm very much indebted to Charles Fox earlier on mentioning Brunel and the Great Eastern in relation to the Magnetic Crusade, because the Great Eastern is such a brilliant example of how difficult it is to navigate an iron ship around the world with a compass. In 1839, the British government agreed to finance a global magnetic survey to resolve this challenge, yet it remained troublesome to measure magnetic phenomena because of the difficulty of constructing reliable instruments for such work. Sorry, this should have come up earlier on. This is the difference between magnetic north and anyway, that's the difference between magnetic north and geographic north. To calculate magnetic deviation is simple. You just determine where the geographic North Pole is in relation to maybe the North Star, or perhaps in relation to some, something on land that you know the position of. But to measure dip and intensity is a far more complex problem, requiring the delicate vertical balancing of a magnetized needle so that it oscillates in response to the Earth's magnetic force. These instruments, dipping needles, were simple in principle, with the earliest examples dating back to the 16th century. But they were also immensely delicate, and the solution was not really provided until the 1830s by a Cornish natural philosopher, Robert Weir Fox, who designed a dipping needle specifically for the purpose of performing experiments on rough seas. This instrument, the subject of the lecture today, was by far the most eminent product of 19th century Cornish natural philosophy. Throughout the 1840s, it was to become one of the most celebrated, yet forgotten emblems of imperial science. So, let's go to Rose Hill. In October 1834, Sir John Franklin, probably looking slightly younger than this, arrived in Falmouth for dinner at Rose Hill. As one of a cohort of celebrated naval officers experienced in polar exploration, he was well aware of the urgency for reliable magnetic instruments. Since 1818, the Royal Navy had been engaged in a relentless search for the fabled Northwest Passage between Canada and the Arctic through to the Pacific. For over a decade, a series of expeditions had all returned to Britain disappointed, but with a growing awareness of the capricious nature of magnetic phenomena. So when Franklin read a published account of a new dipping needle, supposedly well suited to survey work, he wasted little time in hurrying off to meet his maker, Fox, and examined the instrument for himself, near where we're all today, just up the road. What he found at Rose Hill was a profoundly Cornish product. Traditionally, instrument makers had suspended needles by resting them on axes, which sit, as you can see, very delicately on fragile supports. This is quite a traditional dipping needle. I think this one was in use at Greenwich through the 1840s in a nice stable environment, nice stable observatory. Fox, however, had developed his device far from the observatories of Göttingen and Paris and Greenwich. His initial philosophical inquiries had consisted of measurements of heat within Cornish mines, which he found increased with depth. Throughout the 1820s, he performed hundreds of subterranean experiments, collecting data with which to make bold claims over the great heat of the Earth's interior. In particular, he was interested in how this heat might affect magnetic phenomena. A fashionable subject since Ørsted and Faraday had established that electricity and magnetism were related and could produce motion. Believing that copper and tin veins formed through a combination of subterranean heat and electricity, Fox mapped out the courses of rich mineral deposits. But to do this accurately required robust magnetic instruments to give bearings underground amid the dirt and heat of the mine. For this work, delicate dipping needles were useless, leaving with Fox with little choice but to make his own. And this is quite good fun. There is a map of some of his experiments, sort of conducting electrical currents through mines. This is sort of underground. And this, Henry de la Beche draws a comic of one of Fox's experiments where you tie a miner to a rope covered in lots of clothes, and as he's descended, he strips off because it gets so hot. I think Fox actually had quite a sense of humour because they remained friends. Instead of balancing the needle on a support, as in a traditional dipping needle, Fox used jewelled holes, as we saw earlier on, in which the axis of the needle was held by friction alone. The needle was free, but held by friction. Fox's device, this is what Franklin would have read in the Annals of Electricity. Fox's device not only measured dip, which could be done by directing the needle north and measuring the angle shown, but also intensity. After a dip measurement, this was done by applying a magnet, as we saw earlier on, back to the back of the instrument, causing a deflection to the needle, and then you add the weights to coerce the needle back to the angle of dip. This allows you to literally weigh the Earth's magnetic field. So Fox's instruments, designed for experiments within Cornwall's mines, were relatively robust, which made them ideal for on-board ships, survey work, basically. Franklin was immensely impressed with what he found, staying late into the evening for dinner at Rose Hill, marking the start of a crucial relationship for promoting this instrument. Franklin's chance to advance Fox's needle came soon after, with an expedition announced to the Euphrates River, launched in the hope of establishing a trade route to India via the Persian Gulf. On the 22nd of November, 1834, Franklin breakfasted with Captain Chesney, the expedition's commander, and persuaded him to take a fox type with him. Franklin subsequently shared details of the Fox's needle with the Admiralty, with Francis Beaufort, who was equally impressed. Then, at the 1835 British Association for the Advancement of Science, Franklin and Fox met in Falmouth. They went over to Dublin with an instrument which they showed to the leading magnetic specialists of the age, in Britain at least, James Clark Ross, Edward Sabine, and Humphrey Lloyd. Over the next 3 years, they employed Fox types within their ongoing survey of the British Isles, the magnetism of the British Isles, and they produced these charts of fixed measures of dip, sort of actually put over a geological map, which is quite interesting in itself. After Franklin's intervention in 1834, the stock of Fox's instrument rose dramatically, especially within the Royal Navy's Discovery Service. Fox's home and gardens at Falmouth, as the final port of departure for Atlantic-bound naval vessels, made the ideal venue for officers to visit and witness the device firsthand. A trip to Rose Hill, where tea or dinner accompanied demonstrations of the dipping needle, was easily accessible to the Navy's leading magnetic enthusiasts. The most famous of these visits took place in 1836. On the 2nd of October that year, after a 5-year circumnavigation of the globe, quote, a dirty little vessel with her old rigging worn to shreds came into Falmouth Harbour, which was the Beagle. The day before, she had ploughed through a gale off Land's End, during which its celebrated naturalist Charles Darwin had been sick one last time, after an entire voyage of being seasick. Desperate for land, Darwin fled the ship and hurried off to Shrewsbury, took the first carriage up to Shrewsbury, and he never went to sea again. The Beagle's captain, Fitzroy, however, had different plans. Overnighting in Falmouth, he went to Rose Hill to examine a fox type. Quote, he came to see Papa's dipping needle, with which he was highly delighted, noted Fox's daughter, Caroline. After exchanging stories of the Beagle's exploits for details of the dipping needles over afternoon tea and then a lengthy dinner, Fitzroy retired to his bunk. I think it's good that we had the scones and tea. It's very traditional to discuss magnetic measures over tea. But the next morning, Fitzroy returns to Fox's home, completely overstimulated at the revelation of having seen the instrument. Barclay Fox, Weir Fox's son, was delighted that Fitzroy breakfasted here and reports that he was not able to sleep from the philosophical excitement of last evening. Fitzroy could not resist a trialling of the Beagle's French dipping needle against Fox's device in the tropical peace and relative magnetic isolation of Rose Hill Garden. Evidently, the instrument had an almost mystical power of exciting even the most well-travelled of naval officers. Darwin must really have regretted missing out on this dramatic culmination of the Beagle's voyage. The expedition's final discovery was a Falmouth-built magnetic instrument. Given the fox type's growing reputation among naval audiences, it's little surprise that the Admiralty selected it for Ross's Antarctic expedition in 1839. With Fox's needles on both Terror and Erebus, Ross and Crozier measured the Atlantic's magnetic field from Falmouth to Cape of Good Hope. The expedition established magnetic observatories at St Helena and Cape Town, before sailing east across the Indian Ocean towards Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. At Hobart, it founded the third and final of its magnetic observatories, Ross Bank, named after Ross, obviously, a modest man, and then made a course towards the South Pole, breaking through the dense pack ice below New Zealand in January 1841. I think we became the first to break through that pack ice. A week later, Ross observed the mountainous peaks of a huge expanse of land, Antarctica, which he immediately claimed for Britain. Terror and Erebus followed the coast but found it impossible to reach the pole. Nevertheless, Ross used his fox type to measure a dip of 88 degrees south, 160 nautical miles from the magnetic pole, and therefore this instrument became the first device to accurately pinpoint the South Magnetic Pole's location. And here's a fantastic painting of the expedition. We've got the penguins down here, which Ross reported attacked his crewmen as they tried to disembark. Aggressive penguins were the worst of his problems, it seems. And there's quite a cool whale there as well. Terrifying, I'm sure. One like that Abe Franklin. Anyway, here's James Clark Ross himself, and as you can see the iconography of the dipping needle. This is Ross. He was the first man to get to the magnetic North Pole in 1831, and he did it with this, well, apparently, calculated it with this delicate little device, and how dashing and young he looks there, very fine, and obviously the North Pole. But then this is him after he's been to the South Pole, and we see here on the table the fox dipping needle. So I've only just noticed that, got the little ivory handle. So isn't that nice? But yeah, dipping needles, these are the two most famous portraits of him, and each one has a dipping needle, so fantastic. And he's not looking too bad in a picture like that, really. Ross would complete 2 further journeys south before returning to Britain in 1843. By any measure, this expedition had been a roaring success, exhibiting how state funding and the mobilisation of Britain's naval and colonial assets could fashion new knowledge of natural phenomena. The performance of Fox's needle, his instruments in locating the South Magnetic Pole, secured them unprecedented fame, ensuring that they became the standard issue for subsequent naval expeditions tasked with expanding Britain's magnetic survey. When, in 1841, the African Civilization Society, established to promote Christianity in Africa and end slavery, won government funding to send an expedition up the River Niger, Parliament was eager that the examination of magnetism be added to the mission's objectives. His meeting in Exeter Hall, very evangelical. The government paid for the construction of 3 steamships, the Albert, Sudan and Wilberforce, which would sail deep into Africa to fulfil the Society's ambitions. These vessels were to be operated by the Royal Navy, with Captain Trotter commanding the expedition from Albert and commanders William Allen and Bird Allen, respectively commanding Wilberforce and Sudan. They're actually designed as giant floating air pumps to purify the air from malaria, which is interesting in its own right. The expedition would help determine, as Sabine put it, quote, the magnetic state of the whole globe by systematic observations made nearly contemporaneously at almost every accessible part of its surface. Quote. He issued each ship with a custom-built fox dipping needle, ensuring that the supposed civilization of Africa would go hand in hand with the advance of magnetic science. The expedition set sail in May 1841, reached the Niger in August, and at first all seemed to go well as the crews made contact with the river's rulers. Captain Trotter signed 2 treaties with local chiefs, agreeing to end slavery and allow Christian missionaries into the territory, and assist with magnetic inquiries. But in September, disaster struck. Soon, over a third of the European crew of 159 had perished to the ravages of malaria and yellow fever, because obviously the ventilation system didn't protect them from mosquitoes. The expedition's magnetic results also appeared disappointing, with Bird Allen's fox type apparently producing erratic measurements. But despite these instrumental concerns, Sabine was content with the results. Thanks to William Allen's scrupulous and preserving intention, this data would form, quote, the principal part of the maps for that quarter of the globe. So, for all the people that fever had killed, the crews diligently kept on performing magnetic observations. So, yeah, great story. Good propaganda. The results achieved with fox types in the Antarctic and Niger complemented a growing network of observatories and expeditions, all systematically returning magnetic data from around the world back to Sabine in London and Fox in Falmouth. At Singapore Magnetic Observatory, for instance, Lieutenant Charles Elliott of the Madras Engineers found his fox type a rare source of reliability amid the physically demanding regime of colonial life. Elliott wrote to Sabine in 1845 with dire warnings over his health, quoting it saying, "I've no organic disease that I can make out, past a gradual loss of health and stamina resulting from 5.5 years of magnetic investigations." As for his magnetic apparatus, his fox type was a very nice instrument, but he was sorry to report a recent misfortune to his treasured device in which a local had stolen a set of most valuable needles. Evidently, he prized them. I don't know how much you get on the black market for magnetised needles back then. But Elliot not only directed observations at Singapore's observatory, but surveyed Java, Sumatra, and the whole of those eastern possessions of the Bay of Bengal, sending regular reports and requests for new instruments back to Sabine. On expedition, Elliot would erect a temporary observatory and take several months of readings, which could then be compared to results from Singapore's permanent observatory. Preparing for a fresh venture to Java in the spring of 1845, he applied to Sabine for a new Fox-type dipping needle, shipped out around the world, which was duly sent out from Falmouth. Elliot continued his roaming magnetic observations throughout 1846, reaching the Dutch East Indian capital of Batavia in July 1847, where he finally received a new Fox-type with which to pursue his industrious regime of magnetic data collection. These are some of the results. You can trace the routes of various voyages and also sort of overland expeditions based on, you see dot to dot, all the magnetic measurements. At Java, Elliot would wake every day at 5:30, arrive at his station for 6 for measurements, and continue experiments throughout the afternoon. Accounts of fatigue and tropical disease filled Elliot's genuinely miserable letters back to London. In December 1847, he reported enduring an awful night in which he had suffered a constant attack of fever, but still returned magnetic data for the next day. For all this, Elliot was constantly impressed with the reliability of his Fox type. He says, I've taken an immense number of observations of dip with your Fox, which is a beautiful instrument and works remarkably well. In August 1849, exhausted, he reached Madras, content at having magnetically surveyed some 50 stations across Borneo, Singapore, the Cocos Islands, and India. It had all been rather heroic and made for stirring reading in the British tabloids. I'm not sure if they had tabloids, but press. Don't want to get all murdered. By far the most ambitious magnetic expedition, however, was HMS Samarang's voyage to Southeast Asia, where between 1843 and 1847, Captain Edward Belcher magnetically surveyed Borneo, the Philippines, Korea, and Japan. With Hong Kong, his staging post, Belcher's expedition fostered new relations with diverse populations and explored previously unknown lands in the pursuit of magnetic science. It helped that Belcher was already vastly experienced both in magnetic survey work and in cultivating goodwill with local dignitaries. He also knew Fox's instruments quite well, having used them throughout his previous expedition aboard HMS Sulphur, which had surveyed the coast of America from Vancouver to Panama between 1837 and 1839. After being instructed to return to England by way of the Pacific, Belcher reached Singapore in 1840, where he learned of an outbreak of hostilities between Britain and China and was ordered to take part in the conflict over opium, sailing to the Canton River. The Sulphur saw significant action, helping to destroy large portions of the Chinese fleet, being transformed from an instrument of scientific exploration into a weapon of destruction. It's quite dark, really, how the history of science is so intertwined with the history of conflict and war and the expansion of empire. Sulphur finally returned home in 1841, but not before Belcher completed the first survey of Hong Kong. So it's also this sort of work, it's helping establish embryonic colonies. As a ship of scientific exploration, the Sulphur was equipped to chart new territories both geographically and magnetically, and these resources could easily be transferred to examining new territories which might form future colonies and profitable trading posts. By late 1842, Belcher was already preparing for another magnetic expedition, having been appointed captain to HMS Samarang. And actually, the reason that he was so eager to go is because his wife was trying to take him to court for infecting her with a venereal disease, which she actually managed to get the surgeon on board HMS Sulphur to testify against the captain. But it was thrown out for a lack of evidence. So I think he was quite glad to get away, really. She wouldn't have him back in the house, obviously. Anyway, so aboard HMS Samarang, his orders were to survey Borneo, the Philippines, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and the Chinese coast, which had recently been opened up thanks to the Treaty of Nanking following the Opium War. For this mission, Sabine ordered a brand new Fox dipping needle on Belcher's behalf, which Samarang arrived in Falmouth to collect in February 1843. This is in 1843. Once in harbour, Belcher joined Fox for tea at Rosehill and took possession of the new Fox type. In Fox's garden, he practiced magnetic experiments and then repeated these on board his ship. You can see the voyages. In fact, actually, I would say that probably this here is probably Samarang. is also, this one across here, is Terra Nobis, 1839, 1840. So it's quite cool, you see the voyages. As the vessel made its way east, Belcher dispatched magnetic measurements back to London. After stops at Singapore, Macau, Hong Kong, the Samurai anchored off Manila in the Spanish Philippines in March 1844. After capsizing in a river, it had to be refloated, which I don't know what that did to the dipping needle. Belcher secured permission for experiments from Captain General Alcala, the governor, who provided an exercise ground south of the city where the expedition could erect the tents of its portable observatory. The governor also appointed an armed guard to keep away the fascinated local crowds, as Belcher suspected, quote, from the fearfully superstitious character of the natives, that some mischief might result from us being taken for necromancers. With the observations ongoing, Alcala visited the tents, quote, and appeared to be much gratified by a viewing of the instruments as well as an explanation of Fox's needle. A crowd of milliners and inhabitants accompanied the governor down to the tents to witness the instrument in action. Belcher explained to Alcala, quote, the nature of our intended operations within his government and the advantages which would result to the civilized world. Fox's dipping needle evidently made quite an impression on Manila's society. I love this global circularity of these instruments, all coming out of Falmouth and going to all these different destinations. 16th of April 1844, the expedition reached Sulu, under the rule of Sultan Jamalu Quran, where Belcher received a far less amicable welcome. On landing to conduct magnetic observations, the Samarang's crew encountered several small parties armed with spears and creces. Belcher reported that, as neither party understood Malay, nor we their language, explanation was impossible. This was just a threatening position. This was not just a threatening position for Belcher's men, but for the Fox dipping needle itself. Belcher wrote, the proximity of their weapons much disturbed our magnetic needle. An armed guard was called out to protect the ensuing magnetic observations, but the iron weapons further disrupted the Fox's oscillations, and no experiments were possible. Similar difficulties were subsequently encountered off the east coast of Borneo on Tawi Tawi Island. It took a long time to find this picture. A pirate stronghold. Often Belcher and his crew were obliged to manage with make-do observatory locations, transforming local environments into places of experimentation. When the Samarang anchored in the Strait of Potentia, a detachment occupied a small island, little more than a reef, and fashioned the coral reef into a site of experimental observation. Forenoon and afternoons were taken before Belcher indulged in a little shell collecting around the reef. However, on returning to the magnetic instruments for noon readings, Belcher and his detachment were surprised to see several natives fleeing the experimental reef platform. Evidently, the mysterious magnetic observatory had aroused the curiosity of the local inhabitants. Shortly, a band of some 40 pirates turned up, a quarter of a mile off, all armed with bundles of spears and dressed in scarlet red. Encircling the magnetic observatory, they began throwing spears. Quote, some fell very near to the instruments. Belcher's men retreated to their gig, clutching their devices, including their Fox. Once on board, they opened fire on the pirates, obviously. On Christmas Day, 1844, the Samarang sighted Pulau Panjang near Borneo. In his search for an observation spot, Belcher could see nothing but loose mud. Undeterred, the expedition's crew took advantage of the mangrove trees that grew along the coast, cutting two down and so that the stumps were just above sea level, building a platform across it on which to mount the Fox type and perform magnetic experiments. He's probably some of the first Westerners to actually visit some of these places, and it's all to perform magnetic experiments. When an account of this featured in Belcher's published narratives a couple of years later, the implications were subtle but clear. The scientific investigation of terrestrial magnetism appeared to bring civilization to the most untamed natural environments, quite literally order from disorder. In August 1845, the Samarang approached its final destination, Japan, anchoring in the port of Nagasaki. Belcher met with the city's dignitaries and explained the purpose of the expedition. While they agreed that the ship could explore the Ryukyu Islands, the Japanese were concerned over the magnetic survey work, informing the captain, quote, that it was forbidden to measure the land of Japan. Discussions remained polite and civil. Eventually, the Japanese officials did secure permission from the emperor, for provisions to be taken on board the ships, and for the crews to go on land, providing they didn't stay after nightfall. Having reached Japan with the expedition's main objectives largely fulfilled, Belcher returned to Hong Kong to refit. With the entrepôt in sight, on 4th of September 1845, Belcher wrote a report of his dipping needle for Fox, which was sent back to Falmouth. "You will be pleased," wrote Belcher, "to find that your circle has determined the first authenticated dip action in Japan or in the Korea. They treated me well, allowed me to remain on shore until midnight. So long as you respect their towns and give women time to hide themselves, they've no objection to you entering their country." It's very evident that Belcher's efforts to respect Japanese customs actively shaped where and when he was able to take magnetic measurements. But more than this, it's clear that Anglo-Japanese cooperation in the pursuit of magnetic science had actually opened up a land very little known to British explorers. Some of the first interactions between the people of Japan and Britain were therefore the direct consequence of this surveying of terrestrial magnetism. As one expedition concluded, so another was just about to commence. Between 1846 and 1850, under the command of Owen Stanley, HMS Rattlesnake circumnavigated the globe, surveying Australia's north coast and New Guinea before crossing the Pacific. This is fantastic. This is the only drawing I have from the 19th century of an actual dip needle experiment in action with a Fox type. It's on top of a mountain in Madeira. Throughout, Lieutenant Joseph Damon took regular magnetic observations on land and sea with a Fox type. I think he's probably the one that's actually taking the measurement. Others on Ross and Belcher's expeditions. The Rattlesnake took measurements at Madeira and Cape Town before sailing for Mauritius. By the time the ship reached Hobart, the expedition already had a wealth of magnetic data and a good understanding of how these results compared to those of previous voyages, which sort of effectively offered a test for the Fox type so they could see how accurate their future measurements would prove. Damon continued to take measurements along the northern coast of Australia, reporting good consistency between his magnetised needles. As ever, the crew encountered new lands and challenges arising from local conditions. At Port Essington, for instance, Damon recorded considerable error arising not from the ship's iron, but from local interference, there being much iron stone all over the beach. Likewise, at Coral Haven, on a patch of coral near Pig Island, he trialled his London-built Robinson dipping needle, a rival to Fox, against the Fox type, replicating this on uninhabited islands in the Coral Sea. He continued to take industrious measurements around New Zealand and across the Pacific, including a string of islands as far as the Falklands. Though there were some anomalies, the return data allowed Sabine to publish the Rattlesnake's results and complete a detailed magnetic declination map for the Atlantic. Little by little, Britain's naval expeditions were completing the magnetic survey of the world's oceans. Of course, not all expeditions worked out so well. The most famous of all magnetic understandings was, notoriously, and this is Britain, so predictably, a complete failure. In 1845, John Franklin led an expedition to the Arctic aboard HMS Terror and Erebus, tasked with finding the still coveted Northwest Passage and magnetically surveying the seas between Greenland and Alaska. The magnetic measurements would be conducted with both Fox and Robinson dipping needles, with much of the work falling to Franklin's second, James Fitzjames. Unfortunately, Fitzjames was disappointed with his Fox, which he described as rotten. Franklin's expedition subsequently sailed into the Arctic and was never seen again. Fears grew back home that they had met with calamity, and between 1848 and the late 1850s, a series of rescue missions were launched, but all failed to locate Franklin's ships. Then, in 1859, a grim discovery was made. This is from the Illustrated London News. Along the beach at Point Victory, Captain Leopold McClintock found the eerie remains of the last desperate stages of Franklin's expedition, including stores and clothing. It seemed the crews had abandoned their ships and tried to escape on foot. Among the debris was all that was left of Franklin's magnetic ambition. The expedition's Robinson dipping needle, taken when the crews abandoned Terror and Erebus, and not discarded until quite late into the disaster. Franklin's starving men had pursued their magnetic research, presumably to the last. I would imagine they probably started eating each other before they gave up on the magnetic experiments. But somewhere at the bottom of the sea up there, there's going to be a Fox type or two on Terror and Erebus. Who knows, maybe one day they'll find it. But I think they abandoned them because they weren't very good. This dipping needle would become celebrated as a symbol of Britain's civilizing influence. And here, obviously, is man imposes, God disposes? Was it nature disposes? But this is Landseer's imagined fate of the Franklin expedition. By the 1850s, the magnetic scheme was being wound down. Sabine's efforts turned to converting the colossal wealth of magnetic data, which looked like this, into charts, which looked like this, order, showing the dip, declination, and intensity of the Earth's magnetic field. This work would not be completed until 1870, but by then it was very clear that terrestrial magnetism changed in such a manner as to defy mapping. But the investigation did have one tangible philosophical claim, establishing a link between solar flares and terrestrial magnetism. Solar spots were well known, dating back to Galileo's observation of dark marks on the sun's surface. But Sabine's magnetic investigation, these expeditions, had revealed coincidences between solar activity and the fluctuations of the Earth's magnetism. Sunspots releasing immense heat and charged particles across the universe increased the intensity of the Earth's magnetic field. In September, it was sort of a conclusion, but in September 1882, Falmouth was full of scientific bustle. 50 years since its founding, the Royal Cornwall Polytechnic Society celebrated its golden jubilee with an extravagant exhibition. Along with meteorological instruments and models of mining and agricultural contrivances, it was the wonders of electricity that provided the festival's greatest spectacle, including a telephone, telegraph, and the illumination of the Polytechnic's hall with swan electric lights. And I'm indebted to Michael Carver for these fantastic pictures. Yet behind the festivities, the Jubilee was in fact a poignant moment, rich in nostalgia, but implicitly, behind all the festivities, it was revealed that Cornwall had fallen quite far behind the rest of the British Isles, especially like centres like London and Cambridge, centres of science. Tellingly, the most iconic of Cornwall's philosophical contributions at this exhibition dated back to the 1840s and was all too familiar. It could have been this dipping needle. Within the hall, on a table alongside a collection of barometers and rain gauges, was Fox's dipping needle, still Falmouth's foremost scientific ware 40 years later. In his address to the meeting, George Whipple, a Devonian physicist and superintendent of Kew Observatory, declared that the data obtained with this instrument had resulted in shipmasters now being able to navigate iron vessels over the world in every direction, which is partly true. Despite Cornwall's decline, Fox's instruments and magnetic investigations had become part of a network of data, devices and practices on which the world's commerce and navigation depended. From Falmouth, Fox had mobilised local resources, including experimental locations like mines, instrument makers, the experiences of passing naval captains, and his own philosophical work within Sabine's magnetic survey. It was one thing to maintain a dipping needle for an experiment in a Cornish mine, but it was quite different, a very different challenge to extend this examination of natural phenomena around the world. Fox and Sabine had, to eradicate error, standardised measurements, brought order to the capriciousness of expeditionary science. To realise this, Fox established a robust system of instrumental correction, maintenance, experimental training in his gardens, instruction for naval officers, and techniques for ensuring precise measurements. Oh God, I haven't got any copyrights for this. The story of Fox's dipping needle represents the transformation of a very local philosophical artefact into a celebrated instrument of imperial science. And this is the imperial telegraphy network around the world, which another system of science holding empire together in the late 19th century. To transform this Cornish science, very local knowledge, beyond its provincial connotations, required a demonstration that the same practices and instruments worked anywhere in the world and in the hands of those far beyond Fox and his close associates. For Victorian society, dipping needles were emblems of scientific progress, iconic of the supposedly civilizing enlightenment of exploration and colonialism. They physically combined imperial and philosophical ideals. Building empires was not just about disciplining societies, but nature itself. One question remains: how well exactly did they live up to this reputation? Well, we don't really know, but in this matter, I do feel that I might provide some sort of personal assessment, if you indulge me for a moment. In 2020, I was fortunate enough to take this dipping needle, as I'm sure you're all aware, built in Falmouth by William George sometime between 1843 and 1845, to sea for 3 months. Tracing the route of Ross's 1839 to 43 expedition as far as Cape Town, before circumnavigating Africa with detours to the Seychelles, Sri Lanka and India, we followed some of the celebrated routes of HMS Terror, Erebus, Beagle, Rattlesnake and Samarang. With the aid of my assistant and subaltern, Crosby Smith, I reenacted magnetic experiments with the Polytechnic's Fox type, measuring the Earth's magnetic qualities over vast expanses of time and space. We came to appreciate the instrument's qualities and failings, its value for scrutinising terrestrial magnetism and its fragility. There were natural challenges, including the accumulation of salt, an ant's nest on the docks of East London, and the needle's loss of magnetic strength during rough weather off Land's End, as well as the outbreak of COVID whilst we were sailing around. And there were human challenges too, from my own personal lack of experimental skill to a near arrest by Lisbon's harbour authorities. I think they thought I was planting a bomb. Crosby, my assistant, stood on the ship taking pictures while the security came out and questioned me on what I was doing. When I tried to wave him down, he just stood there taking pictures. So they would have gone with that. And the needle would have been in some Portuguese prison. These trials, I think, and I hope I've got across today, echoed some of those that were encountered by 19th century users, in which they recorded as they circumnavigated the world, human and natural challenges. By the time we reached St. Helena, we knew our Fox type's mysterious character well, going as far as to name her Caroline, after Fox's daughter and celebrated diarist. Wherever she went, from Cape Verde to Cape Town to Colombo and Mumbai, the Fox dipping needle always attracted a crowd. For all its technical shortcomings, it became very clear as to how Fox's dipping needle acquired its historic celebrity, and how, through its mesmerising oscillations, it became such a venerated symbol of British science. Let's hope that the Fox needle has not, in fact, had its last voyage. And I'd like to end there. And I'd also just like, very, very briefly, this is not an exhaustive list, I couldn't thank everyone. I've written it down because I would probably forget, but I'd like to thank everyone who has helped, invited me here today, has helped with getting the dipping needle sent around the world. It's just been absolutely fantastic. I've really enjoyed every moment, and thanks all for coming. It's been lovely.